in a Vite server-side rendered application. In this case, I'm using React. However, this does apply to the Vue and Svelte frameworks as well. Yes, it is possible to fetch initial data on the server side using something like Node.js's node fetch library, although one could use the Axios library as well, and then hydrate that data to the client side for consumption. The way that this approach is taught online generally goes something like this. Of course, you would leverage the Express library for Node.js to help you out. But you would write a function to fetch the data. You would then serialize the data and then assign that data to a JavaScript dunder property. Of course, the JavaScript dunder property is a double underscore. It is a global property, and then assign that global property as a prototype to the window object. And then one would pass that data to the client via some sort of placeholder template here. And then it will be passed to the client side on in HTML file. Here's the placeholder for the data when it is initially, when the page initially load. Now, if you're familiar with how the browser works, you can see clearly that there is a cybersecurity vulnerability with this approach. I highly discourage you from using this approach. If you're curious as to why I have a server dev and a server prod, it is simply to separate the concerns for easy readability. These two files can certainly live in the same code file, and then one could incorporate some sort of control flow, if else statements, based on the environment, whether it be development or production. Obviously, in development, you would need Vite, but in production, you use Node only. Again, please do not do this. I will not be including this code in the GitHub because I think it is a very dangerous approach. And if you're curious as to why it is dangerous, let me just briefly state this. I won't describe it in detail, but between this part of the code and this part of the template, there are, let's just say that there are many vectors of attack between here and here. Now, this isn't to say that these are the only vector, but there certainly it is a big one. So please, again, please avoid this approach. To satisfy your curiosity, I ran this bad approach and locked out the data that's being fetched on the server side. And of course, it's just JSON formatted data. The only difference is that it's being fetched on the server side rather than from the client. And then in the browser, if I were to console log out window and then dot dunder data, remember we assign the data to this dunder prototype here and attach it to the window object, the global window object, at least the global object on the client side, which I think is a non-standard practice and should be avoided. Now, having said all of this negativity, let me offer one approach to fetching initial data in a Vite SSR app that I think is a bit safer. Before we start, let me just say that Next.js, warts and all, is a well-known commodity, and Remix, which actually sits on top of the Vue.js platform, are viable options if you want a React-based framework for your server-side rendering needs. What I'm presenting here is an option that offers you more control of your server-side rendering application on the Vue.js platform. Please allow me to introduce you to Vike. I'm using the Norwegian pronunciation of the word, but if you want to call it Vike or Vike, that's perfectly fine. The Vike library used to be called Vite plugin SSR, which is still around, but it's no longer being updated. I bring up this point to bring attention to the fact that the legacy of Vika has been around for a while, at least 3 years ago, for what that's worth to my audience. Vika is on the list on the official Vue.js list of awesome Vite plugin for server-side rendering libraries. Again, for what's that's worth to my audience. Please also allow me to introduce you to the creators and lead maintainers of the Vika library, as well as its current major contributors. Now, there is a YouTube video that Rom made during the Vite.js 2024 conference where he briefly presented the Vika library. I will reference this video momentarily. Before we continue, I will address an issue with Vika that is considered somewhat controversial, and that is what they refer to as open source pricing. As a quick reminder for those who aren't aware, Next.js is developed by a company called Vercel, and Remix is developed by a company called Shopify, both of which are for-profit companies. Now, there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. I love profits just as much as the next guy because I like to have food, shelter, and medical care just as much as the next guy. Before you shut the door on this wonderful library because of this so-called open source pricing, you will find that the quote-unquote pricing is quite flexible. The pricing is only for large companies with large apps, and the actual price is pay what you can afford to pay. Organization can also apply for a free license. You will have to contact the team and justify why you want a free license. I would imagine that this would work well for nonprofits organization or for startup companies. I mentioned a YouTube video earlier in the video regarding um, what Rom had produced, explaining what Vika is and its pricing structure. I will leave the link to this video in the description. The reason why I am bringing this issue up and the reason why I introduced the team earlier is because I wanted the audience to know that these open source libraries and open source tools that we use every day are developed by human beings, living, breathing human beings, not machines. Now, React itself is developed internally at Facebook, which is owned by Meta. And Meta, its its stock shares are majority owned by Zuckerberg, who was a multi-billionaire. And the reality is that most software engineers around the world are not billionaires, not millionaires. They're just average people. Sometimes they live in cockroach infested apartments. I know I do. And I get absolutely nothing from making these YouTube videos. And sometimes I ask people to subscribe to my channel in the hopes that one day, once I have enough subscribers, I'll get something from YouTube. Um, maybe it's just a pittance, but it is what it is. And so, I guess what I'm asking is people to consider is that human beings who need food, shelter, medical care, everything that a living, breathing human being needs to survive, um, they're the ones that are building these tools for us to use. And ironically speaking, sometimes these company, massive publicly traded and for-profit companies use these free tools and contribute nothing to the developers of these free open source software. If you are familiar with the ergonomics or developer experience of Next.js, then you will catch on to Vika very quickly. Vika has similar features that Next.js has, and at the time of this recording, perhaps even more. Vika has the basics covered, like a command line interface, routing or routing, depending on which side of the pond you're from, and custom functionality hooks, to name but a few. And then there is the documentation. Oh boy, this is the mother of all documentation. We don't normally get this kind of docs in an open source project. Everything you ever wanted to know and things that you didn't know you wanted to know are covered in the docs. It would take me a good 45 minutes to do justice to the docs alone. The Vika team also provides very useful GitHub repositories demonstrating the various approaches and development patterns for Vika using various front-end technology, including React, of course, Vue, and Solid.js. Unlike Next.js, Vika gives developers multiple options on how they want to integrate Vika in their project, giving developers more control over their applications. For example, they could integrate Vika incrementally instead of going all in. And if they decide to back out of using Vika, it would be an easier process for them to unburden themselves of said library. Let's start by going all in using the Bati command line interface tool, which the Vike team recommends and developed. This approach will give you the most Next.js-like developer experience and pretty much gives you everything straight out of the box. I will be using npm, but only because it is still widely used in the industry and I wish to cover the widest audience base. However, it is my opinion that pnpm is a superior technology. And as you can see before you, Bati gives you a multitude of options to scaffold your applications. And as you can see before you, I have used the npm create Bati command in my terminal with the React flag to specify to use the React library, and then I give it the name of the application. It runs the installation and the setup. I cd into my project. I run an npm install, and we now have a Vike project using React scaffolded. And as I've stated previously, this configuration will give you the entire kitchen sink straight out of the box. It installs the Vike npm package and the Vike React npm package, which saves you from having to do a lot of the manual configuration in your application. Perhaps the most beneficial feature of Vike is the protection from cyber attacks for the attack vectors that I mentioned at the beginning. There are two modules that are imported from the main Vike npm package, that is escapeInject and dangerouslySkipEscape. And generally, this is how it is implemented. And we'll get more into this later. But when you scaffold the project with Bati, this is automatically implemented for you behind the scenes, because when you scaffold the project with Bati, it automatically uses the Vike React package in addition to the Vike package. I will show you how to configure this manually as well. It is in the docs. Of course, like I said previously, this documentation is very, very thorough. You might have noticed in my VS Code that version control was showing 3000 plus diffs for Git. The reason for that is because when the team added a gitignore file for npm, remember you can configure the project with npm, yarn, or pnpm, which is my favorite, or bun. The thing with npm is that when you have a gitignore, a .gitignore in your repository, it will automatically convert it to npm ignore. That's just the way the npm works, unfortunately. I have contacted the Bati team regarding this issue, and they are looking into it. But for the time being, you just simply change the name from npm ignore to gitignore, and we're back in business. And it should be displaying the correct changes. And it is because I install npm packages, the log package show a diff, and of course now we have a new file called gitignore and an old file that should be deleted. I know I'm being rather pedantic there, but I have a wide audience, so I'm trying to cater to all, or at least to the widest audience possible. So please indulge me. Let's have a look at the application architecture in VS Code. Now, I would not be insulting your intelligence by regurgitating to you what is already in the documentation. Rather, I will just give you a high-level overview as to why we have certain files in our scaffolded project. Let's have a look at the completed demo application in the browser so that we can have a better understanding of what's going on in the code. Obviously, the left nav bar is controlled by the built-in router, and the welcome route is the index route. We have the link component as a reusable component for the built-in router, and the link is built into the, or is included within the default layout. Now this pattern is similar to what's in in Next.js version 14 or older, which is what I'm most familiar with and have worked with professionally. And this is the sidebar and of course the main content as is chosen. Obviously, this is open to changes by the developer, and I think it is a easier pattern to grasp than in Next.js for me personally. Following the convention that has been around for 6 or 7 years now, we have a directory that is named pages, and anything that is under the control of the built-in router is placed within this directory. To include the index route that I showed you earlier. As you can see here, we have um, the index route with the obligatory React counter that I showed you earlier. And this is the index route as indicated here once again. With respect to the to-do component, it is merely just an in-memory storage for the time being. If I refresh this, it'll go away. And this is the code for the to-do portion. Now, if you don't already know, by convention, anytime that there is a plus sign in front of a file name, it just means that this code file will contain or maintain some sort of configuration for the application or for that particular part of the component of the application. It is by convention only. And in this case, the configuration is saying that we do not want to have pre-rendering here because we are doing server-side rendering. So pre-rendering is SSG and server-side rendering, of course, is SSR. And we only want SSR. And the data portion, the data is coming from this in-memory only um, uh, quote-unquote database here. And then um, the page itself is that is essentially the view, right? It's the view that's connected to the router. And that view is going to be rendering the to-do list, which is coming from here. Okay. And that is it for the to-do portion. Let's have a look at data fetching in Vike. So initial data is being fetched from this API here, and we are making a get call, get all in this case, get a collection of Star Wars movie. Back in the code. So if you look at this design pattern, you might notice that there is this concept of like a code behind, and then the HTML, or in this case, JSX view for it. Now, in the past, if you work with, heaven forbid, .NET, ASP.NET, or JSP in the Java world, or PHP, you might have seen this pattern before, where you have the UI for something, and then you have the code behind doing the heavy lifting in terms of data logic, or database logic, or API logic. And essentially, this is the same pattern here. And so this is for the get collection, the get all collection. We're going out to this API. In this case, it is just a flat JSON file. And we're minimizing, we're streamlining the call as much as possible to make it more efficient so we don't waste people's bandwidth. And then we're using that on the client side, right? It's so, I mean, it's simple, that is brilliant. We are also able to do an individual call, or get one call, based on the ID of the movie. And if you notice here that in the title of the tab, individual tab, we get the title of the movie, which helps tremendously with SEO, search engine optimization. The Empire Strikes Back, The Empire Strikes Back. And let's do one more for good measure, Return of the Jedi, Return of the Jedi. And here is where that code is coming from. First, we have the template, the JSX, and then the code behind. Familiar pattern. And the built-in router works very similarly to React router, and is able to extrapolate the params. In this case is the ID, the root params, the ID from the JSON file. And then that's how we are able to fetch the individual movie from the collection. And then the part where it is dynamically setting the title, the movie title, to the title of the tab is here. And this is something that is built into Vike. Additionally, we can also set the metadata. We can also set the meta tag in the HTML file, the index.html file. There is a meta tag, and within that tag, there's an attribute called description, and we can set the description as well. And so we have um, the ability to set the description of the meta tag as well as the title, which is very, very useful for SEO. And this comes essentially straight out of the box with Vike. And I will show you how to do that in a bit. Moving on down, we have the main config file for the app itself. And in here, we are specifying the layout, which in this case is the default layout, but we can have different type of layouts if the developer wants it, which is again very flexible. And here we have the default for the title for the tab and the default for the description in the which is the attribute inside of the meta tag in the index.html file, again for SEO. And of course, this is the head for the HTML page, which is we can control. Uh, it is dynamic, just like in any other uh, spa application. And then we have these two hooks, on page transition start and on page transition end. And these two are tremendously useful if we wish to add some sort of CSS style animation when a view transition and when it ends, when it's completed its transition to that view. We can also, aside from the CSS animation, we can also add functionality here if we wish. Let's see what it looks like in the browser. Again, directing your attention to the console. So whenever I click on each link, you can see that we have a page transition start and a page transition end. So when the views transition and when it's completed loading the views. This is akin to a very old version of React back in the day when we were able to tap into the life cycle, event life cycle hook, if you will, which which has now been replaced by the use state hooks. Vike also comes out of the box with an error page to where if there is a route that is not valid, it will render an error in the browser for you. They also have documentation on how to deploy your SSR application to multiple hosts, including Vercel, which we will be doing together for the tutorial application that we're going to build together later on. In the Get Started portion of documentation, there is a section for custom integration where it says we recommend using such advanced capability, which can be complex to use, only if you have a clear reason for doing so. Well, our reason is that we want to fully understand how Vike works. And for that reason, we are going to scaffold a Vike React Vite SSR app uh, using a different approach, a more minimalistic approach. Not completely minimalistic, that will come later, but we're going to run the command npm create Vike at latest. Of course, you will have the option of using my favorite, which is pnpm, among others. Again, we're using npm just to cover the widest audience base because npm is still being used a lot in the corporate world. Um, and of course, there's an option for it's going to tell you what is going to be involved in the command line, and then you also present it with various GitHub repository that will support various approaches that you can follow along. And so as you can see before you, I've ran the command to install and scaffold Vike a different way, and all is well. So if we were to look at the package.json file for this scaffold, because we are not using Bati, we are abstracting less Now, this application architecture is starting to look more like a regular Vite SSR application. We are using Node.js on the server side, of course, and we are using the Express Node.js library to help us make things more succinct. Obviously here using Express 4, but I will ultimately be converting this to Express 5 for better security. And like a conventional quote unquote um, Vite SSR application, we are creating our own Node.js server. However, because we are using Vike, we are pulling in a module from the Vike library to be used as middleware. But the remaining portion is similar. The pattern is similar to what we saw in the Bati scaffold application. We have the similar architecture that we saw in the other application, but we have a few more hooks, custom hooks that are not abstracted for us anymore, but is still visible and still configured for us to include the cybersecurity portion, and that is escape, inject, and dangerously skip escape, which is being brought in from the Vika library. Let me also mention that if we go with this approach, the only reconfiguration that we as developers have to do is to inject the Vika library into the vconfig file. That's pretty much it for in terms of Vite specific configuration. And then everything else, the name of the game here, I think, is offering control to the developer. And in terms of the project, it's the same as before without the silly to do. Let's take a look at it. It's still fetching data. That little latency there is a timeout function in the code. And we still have the transition start and end for view loading. That's before. And as a reminder, ladies and gentlemen, my dear friends, they have provided us with various repository, GitHub repository or repository, depending on what side of the pond you're from, whereby we can follow the patterns uh, for the various approaches to building out a Vika Vite React application. Of course, I'm using React, but you can use other libraries as well. And so from this approach, from this scaffolding, what we will be basing our final tutorial project on. The final project that we will be building together is a server-side render application that fetches product using node fetch on the server side, on the Node.js side, not on the front end. It will fetch 10 products because I control the amount of product that's being fetched, but I give you the ability to control how many products being coming back from the API. So it's fetching a collection of products from this API, and then we can drill down into each individual product. And as you can see here in the title of the tab, the name of the tab is based on the title of the product. And then when we go back to the landing page, the title is just, it says 10 dummy ink products available. And you can change that to whatever you like, but we can control that. Okay. And then if we inspect the meta tag for description, so when it is on the landing page, it just says, enjoy the many wonderful products at affordable prices from Dummy Inc. store. But if we drill down into each product, you can see that it's dynamically changing on the fly. You can, I will show you how to set this to wherever you like, but for the time being, I have the content to match the description in the name of better SEO. Of course, you can change this value to whatever it is you want coming back from the API, the JSON file that's coming back from the API. And then if we were to go down to powder canister, we can see that that's dynamically changing. Dynamically changing back to the landing page, you can see there. Then we go way down here to the cologne or perfume or whatever that is. You see there it's dynamically changing. And as you can see from the URL, I have already deployed the app to Vercel, and I will show you how to do that as well. The starting point for our application will be a vanilla Vite client-side application using 10-stack query to fetch products for us. So just a vanilla client-side application, it's already using Vite and React. So in this scenario, we are going to cover the case where we have a Vite React client-side front-end application, but for various reasons, we wish to convert this application to a server-side um, React application using Vite on the Vite platform so that we can optimize SEO and for other reasons. So that is the use case scenario that we are operating upon. And per usual, I have a GitHub repository or repository, depending on what side of the pond you're from, for you. The main branch is the completed branch, and it is deployed to Vercel. But it could also be deployed to GitHub pages as well as Cloudflare, among others. Where you should start, where you should pull down this project is the project start. Now, don't worry about the failure there. I'm not deploying this to Vercel because obviously it's just a starter project. Again, remember the use case scenario I mentioned a few seconds ago. We're converting from a client-side Vite React app to a server-side React app. In this project starter, I am using 10-stack query to fetch the data. Now, it is possible to use 10-stack query with Vike. There's documentation for that from Vike, of course. The first thing I like to do is to install the necessary npm packages. Now, where I diverge from the Vike minimalistic installation, if you will, is that I will have linting. So therefore, I've added the packages to accomplish to that end. Now, we have also installed packages that were abstracted for us in the Bati installation, but here we will have to install them ourselves. Of note is node fetch. because we will be fetching data on the server side, not on the client side, because we want to have that data ready to go for us on page load. And of course, we have other necessary accoutrements to have a Vite server-side rendering application. While we are in the package.json file, let us go ahead and update the scripts to have processes that are necessary to run a server-side rendering app, as well as to work with TypeScript. And once we have installed Vike, we want to open the Vite configuration object at the Vike package to the plugins. Of course, you have to import that. Now, in a Vike application, the source directory isn't necessary, and it's just another layer that the CPU has to work out. I move the pages directory outside of the source directory, and I've created a renderer directory and a server directory. I can go ahead and delete the public directory, and then the main.tsx file. These items here we will reuse and repurpose later. Soon I will be deleting the source directory as well. I've also removed the other TypeScript configuration object and updated the one that I'm keeping, and that is the tsconfig.json file. Again, as a reminder, I am basing our project on the boilerplate that was provided in the documentation by the Vike team. In the server directory, of course, in this case, the server is referring to the Node.js server. That is the server portion of server-side rendering application in Vite. I have a TypeScript configuration object, and then I have inside of the root file definition for the path for Node.js to use. And then this file will be called inside of the index file. Now, if you watch my video on how to spin up a Vite server-side rendering application using React, this will look very familiar to you. And essentially, it's the same thing with one notable exception, and that is we are importing the render page module from Vike, and this will act as middleware, like I said at the beginning of the video. The other exception, the other difference is that in this project, I have updated Express. Now, Express is a Node.js library to make life a little bit easier. I've upgraded this to version 5. And in version 5, for the get all, the wildcard route, we need to have some sort of string after the asterisk. So I figured I'd just add the word all to it. Now, I would imagine that once the Vike team upgrade Express to version 5, that will add something very similar. But this bit here is required in Express 5. So now we have our server. So this takes care of the server side. Let's start to fill in the renderer directory next. By convention, the renderer directory contains all of the rendering logic for the application. If you have rendering logic that are different, very different from each other, you may create multiple renderer directories. See the documentation for details. Now, if you recall, in the application that was scaffolded using Bati it didn't have a renderer directory. That's because when we use Bati to spin up a Vike application, it included the Vite React npm package, which abstract a lot of that away from us. But I think that having a renderer directory um, paints a better mental model for us to understand Vika. I went ahead and pasted in all of the CSS styles for us, as well as the SVG. You don't want to see me typing in CSS. That's really outside the scope of this overview. This logo here is the Vika logo that is used in the left nav bar as well as for the fav icon. I actually have an SVG image of Taylor Swift. Let me know in the comments if you guys want me to drop that in the code repo. Of importance is the types definition for TypeScript that is provided to us from Vika, and that is to define the Vika in the global namespace to make this work. Next, I want to have a configuration file in the renderer, and we want to import the config from the library and create and export the configuration object. The dynamic title and dynamic description in the meta tags that I mentioned earlier, this is where we enable that feature. These links in the comments were actually provided to us from the Vika team themselves as to why uh, these properties exist. Um, so they have our backs in that respect. And then I also added some comments to further define what I'm doing in this code file on top of what the Vika team gives us. Next, I pasted in two Vika provided universal hooks. The first is use page context. We will use the page context hook as part of the function signature of each page or each component to describe what each page, each component is doing, to give it context, as the name implies. Now, page context also have built-in properties which are defined in documentation that are very useful. I won't regurgitate them here. I will let you peruse that on your own. And that use page context hook is also used to fetch data. Now this use data hook will be used to fetch data on the server side in this case. Link is the next code file that I'm adding. If you've ever worked with React Router, any version, then you certainly have used link. This is the same thing. The conceptually link in Vika is the same, with obviously with additional SSR capability, but conceptually is very similar. At this point, we have enough code files for me to paste in the layout. The layout, as the name implies, provide the layout to the application. The page context provider came from the use page context hook that I pasted in first. And then here we're using the link, like I mentioned earlier, in the same pattern as React Router. So like a wrapper in the higher order function style, which is a pattern we see very commonly in React. Here's the frame, the sidebar, the content, the logo. adjust as needed. I will also say that you see how we're importing the entire React library here, and we only are using, see, strict mode, React node. If you decide to use this, you might want to destructure out your import. Say strict mode and then React node, and then call it, replace the React dot with just React node. That way you're not importing the entire library, and that'll make your app perform much better. Now off screen, I added 4 event handlers and a utility function to get the title for the tab. Now, I've already explained on page transition start and ends previously. This is essentially a lifecycle hook that you can add CSS for the smooth transitioning of views and pages. And I'm sure you could repurpose this for additional functionality that you can dream of. Now, the on-render client and on-render HTML are like the glue code between Vike and React. The on-render client, as the name implies, defines how pages are rendered or hydrated on the client side. The on-render HTML defines how pages are rendered to HTML and is contained a, a couple of critical modules, that is the escapeInject and the dangerouslySkipEscape, to make deny that vector of attack when we hydrate the HTML from the server side. Now the get page title function is used in multiple places to dynamically get the title for the top of the browser. I will go into the dynamic description later on. Now I know that I am glossing over a lot of material, but to keep this video within a decent amount of time, I will refer you to the documentation. For the time being, we are done with the renderer directory. So in the pages directory, I've deleted the former contents and I've added an index directory. And inside of the index directory, I've added a configuration code file called page.tsx. Now, page.tsx is a component that only renders static JSX with a few hyperlinks. And then this view here, this connected, if you will, component that's connected to the router will be used here in this default route via a link. And here is what our app looks like at this point, which is one route, the intro, which is static JSX with a few links. Inside of the pages directory, I've created a directory called fetching products to house all of the code that will be involved in fetching our products from the API. Now, if you recall earlier, we still have the source directory, and in there we have the types, the type definition for products. And go ahead and move that into the fetching products directory. And then in here, in the fetching products directory, create a new directory called index. And in there, move the back to top button component to the index because we will be using that button in here. All right, this is just some code um, to move to the top of the page once the user scroll all the way down in the browser because it could be multiple products. So then at this point, we can say adios to the source directory because we no longer need it. So inside of my fetching products module, index directory, I've created a configuration file called data. And here's what it's going to do. So once I'm done with this function, I will have a function to fetch data from the API, and then I will export the function, and then I will have a type called data with a capital D, which will be the type for this function here, which I will be exporting. Okay. And then in terms of library imports under server side, remember we're fetching data, we're fetching initial data on the server side. So I will import node fetch, and I will use the fetch function, not the client side fetching, but the server side fetching again uh, from the from node fetch, which is a Node.js server side library. I'm sorry to be overly pedantic on that point, but I just want to make that clear, especially for those coming from a client only development side. And of course, I'm bringing in the page context server types, which will be the type definition for page context, which is the call signature for this function. The next few lines of code are just standard TypeScript, JavaScript code to fetch data. But I do want to have a look at the API that we're using though. So here we are in Postman, and I'm making a call to dummy JSON. I'm using dummy JSON because it is a very robust, free, keyword being free API, and it takes the query string param on the number of products coming back. In this case, is 10. I think if you don't put a limit in there, I think you get like 50 back or something like that. There's documentation for this. I will include it in the final code base. Anyhow, so let's have a look at the shape of the JSON coming back. Okay, so obviously you can have an object literal, but you see that products there? You're gonna have an array of objects called products. So we're gonna have to destructure that out. Okay, and by the way, this is a free API. It's robust, like I said. Unfortunately, it has like makeup and girly type products. Don't give me any funny looks. It's a great API and it's free, so that's the only reason why I'm using it. There's no amount of makeup in the world that's gonna stop my fugliness. So off screen, in my types definition file for fetching products, I have added another type which inherits from the products type. That's called product details, which we will be using in a minimize function provided to us by Vike to streamline what's coming back from the API and sent to the UI. And here's the finished code for this page. So we're destructuring out products from the return API, return JSON from the API. I'm using this minimize function here that's provided to us from Vike to extrapolate only what we need from the JSON so that we don't abuse our end user's data plan. And then we are returning the object with the products and the title. And the title is referring to the title of the tab in the browser, okay? And I've added um, this little text here. Let me also make note of something. On line 14, this page context here, this is required. But if you're using ESLint like I'm using here, um, you need to add this line because it'll think that we're not using this page context signature, but in fact we are. So now I'm going to follow the patterns that we've established previously I'm gonna create a configuration code file called page.tsx. It would be a connected component, of course, connected to the router. And then here's the shell for that function for that page. Of course, I'm going to import use data because we will be using the data that we just uh, imported in the configuration file in data there. And then we can have the back to the top button because we are going to have 10 items. It's just the back to top is a convenient button for the end users. Let's go through this function line by line. If you recall, in the data configuration, we exported the function, the data lowercase function itself, and then we also exported this generic data type called data with a capital T. So then in our JSX file, we are destructuring our products from data from that type. And we're using the use data hook. That's why we imported the hook and then we imported that type. Okay. And then this is just JSX here to links it in because we have this products here that we destructure out efficiently. May I add, because we utilize the minimize function there, right? In here. Now we have the products in there and we can map this out. And then we can render it in the JSX. Okay. And of course we have the back to top button to get back to the top. So now we need to go back into the renderer directory and to the layout file, and then we need to create a link to fetching products. Why is it called fetching products? Because we name our directory fetching products. If you name this directory I hate Taylor Swift, then you have to call this I hate Taylor Swift. Now let's go to the browser, and here it is. We initially had intro, the default root, and then now we have the fetching product root. There's our products. There's our back to top button. Okay, make sure that works. Of course, we have not implemented the individual uh, product yet. And so we need to add that next, but before we do that, we need to add a custom error root. I've added the custom error component or page from Vike, and let's see what that looks like when I click on something that doesn't exist yet. There you go. Now, to handle clicking on individual products, inside of the fetching products directory, please add another directory, and name that @id. And again, following the same patterns that we have everywhere else, we're going to have a file called data and a file called page. One for code behind logic and one for the JSX. Isn't it nice to have an established pattern to help your mental model? The data configuration code file for the individual product is similar to how it was for fetch all data, except for one thing. Well, except for, of course, you have to fetch the individual ID, but you're still doing it from the server side. The thing that I want to note here is that, remember earlier in the video, I mentioned dynamic description for the meta tag, where I am setting the description attribute of the meta tag to whatever the description coming back from the API. Well, here's part of where that happens. Okay. And then Um, Also in the renderer, in the onRender client event handler, okay, it's event handler because every time it's changed, the description needs to change. So here on line number 40, now there's multiple ways to do this, and I've linked the documentation for you, but here's how I did it, was that I selected the description attribute from the meta tag, and then I set that attribute to the uh, page contact data, it was there, the description, right? Now, or I just give it a default of enjoy the many wonderful products at affordable prices from Dummy Inc. store. So when when they click on a certain product, right, like shovel, then this will say description of wonderful shovels. But if they go back to the all product page or view, then they're going to get this default description. In terms of the page file, it's the same as for any other page file, the same pattern that is. Um, the only thing here is that I'm bringing in link. I'm bringing link because I want to link them back to the all. If they are on the individual product, I want to send them back to all products once they're done looking at the individual product. Okay, so here we are fetching all products. Let's have a look at the inspector here. So when they are on the landing page, the description says enjoy the many wonderful products at affordable prices from Dummy Inc. store. And the tab says the 10 dummy products available, which is the default one. And then if I were to click on an individual one, of course that changes to match the title here. And then the um, description attribute inside the meta tag for the content. This matches the description here. Okay, it's dynamic. Back to product. Let's find something different. There it is. Of course, you want, in production, in the real world, you will want to change this to whatever makes sense to you. But I'm just doing this to show that it's actually dynamic. Let's do one more. One more time with feelings. Okay, the red nail polish. Okay. A question that I get asked often is, well, what happens if I just want to post data to an API, like from a normal, regular front-end client-side rendering React application? Well, you would just do it normally. So off screen, I've added another component. It's called the Princess of Darkness. Now, I'm not sure if Taylor Swift is the Princess of Darkness. I'm leaning toward maybe yes, but it's all satire. It's all fun. Anyway, anyhow, so I'm here. I'm just doing a post request to an API, a natural API, which accepts a post request. So this endpoint will accept a post request and will send back data to you. Okay, a response JSON to you. Okay, and they added some logic to render that out. And then you would just, um, so I have this page here, and it has just some JSX, and then I've added the Taylor Swift component here. And then in the browser, let's have a look. Okay, so I've added it to the layout page, that component to the layout page. That's why you have that link there. And then if I clicked on this button, there we have a response. So you would just do things normally like you would in any other front-end React application. Let's hit that again. So here's our return a response from the API. In terms of deployment, the Vika documentation has a whole lot of information on that. But let's say you want to deploy to Vercel, which is a free host um, for just trivial app. Um, there's instructions for that, and they even give you a GitHub repo. Essentially, you need to create a vercel.json file, create a directory called API, and inside of that API directory, you create this ssr.js file, and with this code in there. So it'll look like this. Added API directory with a ssr.js file, straight from what's given to us by Vika, and then create a Vercel file that looks like that. Of course, I have all of this in the finish branch, the main branch, the finish app for you already. If you're curious to know what running the npm run prod command looks like, it'll build the app for you and then run the app in production mode. And then it'll generate this dist directory. What's inside the dist directory? Well, this is what's inside. There's a client portion and there's a server portion. And then this is essentially a manifest of all the asset when you click on certain links because it's server-side render. So that's why you need this essentially this manifest file. It's the same pattern that's used when you do a standard Vite SSR application. If you do decide to deploy your app on Vercel using the free service, make sure that in your settings for the output directory, make sure that it's dist client. Okay, dist client as your output directory. A lot of people have asked me this question. They always get tripped up on this. So that's why I wanted to include this in this video. Okay, my dear friends, thank you for sticking with me this far. I hope you give Vika a try. It's a great product, and for the most part, it's open source. And if you work for a company, for a profit company, you're a smaller company, I'm sure they'll work with you on the pricing. Okay, if you like this video, please consider liking and subscribing. I'll see you next time. Bye for now.